Okay, good evening, everyone. I think we'll start now. We've given a few minutes extra for the stragglers, and I think some people are still coming in, but we'll get started. So I want to welcome you. My name is Samira Kanji, and I'm the president of NURAN. So it's always my privilege to welcome you to this space and to welcome you to this event. I want to thank you all for coming. And I, of course, want to thank Professor Payam Akhavan for coming, for privileging us with his presence here, because, of course, without him, you wouldn't be here either. I'm so glad you're here. The topic tonight is immensely important. It's something that's perplexing a lot of us, to see how atrocities, terrible things are happening in plain sight. You know, we have knowledge of these things to an unprecedented degree, and yet it seems the thing just goes on without any resolution. And so it's particularly important and valuable, and I think we're really lucky, and you're really smart to have turned up today, that we have somebody of the stature of Professor Payam Akhavan to talk to us about this, because of course he's an international law expert and he's very involved in this issue. I'm not going to say anything else except to acknowledge the co-sponsors of this event. We have the International Commission of Jurists of Canada, Canadian Centre for International Justice, the McGill Centre for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law, International Human Rights Programme, and University of Ottawa's Human Rights Research and Education Centre. Copies of Professor Akhavan's bestseller book are on sale there, and he says he will sign them for you at the end of the event up here if you're interested. So that's it from me. I just want to remind you all to turn off your cell phones and to make an important, a mundane, but nonetheless important announcement to let you know that washrooms are downstairs. Go down the stairs and turn left, and eventually you'll get to what you recognize as the washrooms. So, without further ado, again, I welcome you. Thank you for being here. Looking forward to a really fantastic, really informative lecture from Professor Payam Akhavan. I'm going to hand over to Aziza, who is going to be our moderator, and she will introduce Professor Akhavan. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Greetings of peace, and welcome to Noor, everyone. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered here today on land that has been the territory of Indigenous nations for many thousands of years, most recently here the Mississaugas of New Credit First Nation. We know that these land acknowledgements are not enough to restore a just, decolonized relationship with the land's Indigenous peoples, but they are a reminder to us of the necessity to work towards a more just future. And as we are gathered here today to talk about the subject of genocide, it is also a reminder to us that genocide is not something that is foreign to this land. It is the very terrain on which we stand. At Noor, we have been distraught for many years by the genocide that the Rohingya people have been facing in Myanmar, and the lack of strong international action to prevent this completely foreseeable crisis in which we are now. And so we were very relieved when the International Criminal Court announced that it would be considering opening an investigation into some of the crimes that have been committed against the Rohingya. And we were honored when Dr. Payam Akhavan agreed to come to Noor to talk to us about the Rohingya situation and some of the mechanisms for achieving justice and accountability for the Rohingya. Indeed, there is no one better than Professor Akhavan to talk about this issue. He is the representative of Bangladesh at the ICC, as well as one of the foremost experts in the world on international criminal law, and specifically the law of genocide. Payam Akhavan is professor of international law at McGill University and a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. He was formerly a United Nations prosecutor at The Hague in the trial of Yugoslav leaders for ethnic cleansing. In June of this year, he visited the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh in connection with a potential investigation by the International Criminal Court. You may also recognize Professor Akhavan's voice from the CBC Massey lectures, which have been playing on CBC radio. Those lectures were made into a book, In Search of a Better World, which, as mentioned, is the volume that is available for sale at the side of the room here for after the talk. And so without further ado, I will invite the man himself, Dr. Payam Akhavan, to come to the stage. And after his talk, there will be time for questions and answer from the audience. So hold tight. Professor Akhavan.
Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. I would like to begin by thanking the Noor Cultural Center and the outstanding Kanji family for this kind invitation and for providing this platform for us to reflect on the tragic plight of the Rohingya, which is unquestionably one of the most pressing human rights challenges of our time. I begin with the quotation from the Quran, which the Noor Cultural Center emblazons on its publicity material, which says, "O humankind, we created you from male and female and made you into nations and tribes so that you may come to know one another. And the best among you is the most God-conscious." This, in my humble estimation, is about a message of oneness, the oneness of humankind, that despite all that divides us, all of the multiple identities that we can claim, that the message of divinity, the message of human rights in the secular age, is that all human beings are the same. All human beings are endowed with dignity, and that the suffering of one part of humankind is the suffering of all. Which is why I think that the Rohingya question is a question for all of humankind, irrespective of what religion we may espouse. And perhaps that is why we speak in international law of crimes against humanity. These are offenses against the very notion of what it means to be a human being. And we are here because the world community, as our kind and eloquent moderator said, has failed to prevent what was essentially a foreseeable genocide, as is the case with most genocides. A genocide is not an earthquake, it is not a tsunami, it is not an unforeseeable natural disaster. It is a political choice. It requires tremendous effort, hate propaganda, the identification of the victim population using the apparatus of the state, the use of armed forces in concerted patterns of ethnic cleansing. It's always the same story. We wake up when it's too late, and we try to pretend that those amassing in the refugee camps in Bangladesh, in Chad, wherever the case may be, are the victims of some kind of a flood, and that, understandably, we must respond through humanitarian assistance. But this is not a problem of a humanitarian catastrophe as such. It is a crime against humanity. It is a crime of genocide. It is the deliberate choice of those in positions of power to victimize and annihilate an entire human group. So while we shake our heads and say never again, only to allow these crimes to happen ever again, we still have to do what we can, what little we can, to achieve justice. Because justice is about exacting a cost for these crimes. We know the adage from the Hollywood films, crime does not pay. Well, sadly, crimes against humanity pays all too often because we have a culture of impunity. So long as the geopolitical equations are appropriate, nobody will pay a price for mass murder. So we need to use what few tools we have at our disposal to try and impose some measure of accountability. And it's very easy to become cynical, angry, and despondent, but I don't think we have time to despair. We must focus all of our efforts on doing what we can, and being here tonight, simply bearing witness to the truth, is itself the first step towards achieving some measure of justice. When we talk about 1 million refugees, 1 million is a statistical abstraction. It really means nothing until you see the intimate reality of suffering, until you see the children with the missing limbs, the women who were 8 months pregnant, having been raped by members of the Myanmar military, the parents whose children are lost, the children who witnessed their parents being killed before their eyes. Behind every victim, there is a name. There is a mother and father, a brother and sister, a best friend and schoolmate, a whole universe of human relations that is forever destroyed. And only by understanding that intimate reality of human suffering will we understand why we cannot remain silent. And only then can we understand that our voices matter, that we have to tell our leaders that we demand action, that this isn't just some tragic event halfway across the world, that this is real, and there's no difference between us and those who suffer halfway across the world. And it's only with that understanding that we can begin to mobilize the political will and steer the conscience of the international community to finally do something. So in that spirit, before speaking about the question of the International Criminal Court, I would like to share with you some images from Kutupalong refugee camp, which I was at in June of this year. Now, Kutupalong was about 2 years ago a wildlife refuge in Bangladesh on the border with Myanmar. There were elephants and all sorts of wildlife rolling about in the beautiful Chittagong hills. Today, it is a city of 700,000 people. There are 700,000 refugees in Kutupalong, and it has taken over from Dadaab, which used to be the biggest refugee camp in the world, Somali refugees in Kenya. Today, Kutupalong has the dubious distinction of being the biggest refugee camp in the world. And it's a site that one has to see to believe the enormity of this sea of misery and suffering. So I would like to share with you very briefly some images taken by a wonderful photographer from Bangladesh. His name is Yusuf Tashar, who, when the refugees were pouring across the border, took it upon himself out of his own pocket, as a very distinguished, well-known photographer in Bangladesh, to go and document the images of these people coming across the border. So I want to thank him for providing these images. And if you read the CBC Current article that just came out yesterday on the question of the Rohingya, they were kind enough to actually use the images of Yusuf. I'm not sure if it's working. Okay, yeah. Is it this button here? Oh yeah, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, there we go. Well, this is just one image of the many, many children that one sees in Kutupalong, and the stories that they tell are beyond description, beyond words. Maybe we can look at the next image. These are some of the images of the children and you see Kutupalong in the background, who line up for food every day to get what nourishment they can. These are some images of very typical images of women and children fleeing across the river. Many of them end up drowning. A big part of the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh is the Naf River. These are other images of those that came across what was then a very flimsy fence separating the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh. And now that about 1 million people have been expelled, that fence has been replaced by a fortified wall, making it impossible for people to return back to Myanmar. So when it came to expelling people, the fence was really quite accessible, but now steps have been taken to prevent anyone from returning. Now, this is an image of myself and one of my colleagues. And as I explained, as the moderator explained, I'm counsel to the government of Bangladesh in the case before the court. So you will appreciate that I'm speaking purely in my personal capacity. I'm not speaking on behalf of the government of Bangladesh or anyone else. I only speak on my own behalf. But I must be sensitive to not crossing a certain boundary when talking about these matters. Is called solicitor-client privilege. Some of you are lawyers will know what I'm talking about. But I was there to speak to some of the survivors, to hear their stories, to better understand the way in which the crimes that have occurred could qualify as a crime within the jurisdiction of the court. And I will explain why that's a significant issue. And just before speaking about this, I want to take an opportunity to introduce my wonderful friend, Member of Parliament Ali Essasi, who just joined us, a very dear friend, Member of Parliament, who has done an outstanding job in speaking exactly about the issues that most members of Parliament don't want to talk about. So Ali, thank you for coming and for the support that you've shown the Rohingya cause. So here, these women, back in June, explained how the Myanmar military that we know are called the Tatmadaw came into their villages, and one heard the same story about the exact same pattern of indiscriminate bombardment and attacks, typically early in the morning when people were sleeping. And then the indiscriminate shooting of civilians, the burning of homes, incidents of torture, of gang rape, of mutilation, truly the worst of the worst. And of course, there are many widows in the camp because the men were typically targeted first for extermination, young men in particular, although in principle nobody was spared. And these women had left around September of 2017 when there was a big wave of refugees. And most of them were about 8 months pregnant. So it wasn't necessary to really say much. It was very easy to connect the dots to know exactly what has happened. So now I would assume that most of the women in that photograph have 2-month-old infants, which are sadly to say the product of rape. And it was incredible to see the courage and dignity with which each one of them would come and tell their stories. Maybe if we go to the next image. which is the image of the women. And this was during the holy month of Ramadan. So you can imagine being in this camp with the squalor and the heat and the sort of oppressive circumstances, and then to be there in the middle of Ramadan, and then to have these women line up one by one, and then to stand up and uncover their face and to tell their story. It was really a deeply, deeply humbling experience. Maybe we can go to the next image. And I chose a number of images because I also want to explain that in the midst of all of the horror, one also sees how incredibly inspiring human beings can be. One also sees the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. So these are members of the Bangladesh border guards. And to me, they are unsung heroes, because when the mass exodus began, there were no UN agencies to receive the refugees. People would arrive destitute, traumatized, wounded, with missing limbs, with bullet wounds, dehydrated, starved, and you saw some of those images. So it was typically members of the Bangladesh border guards that would greet them. And it's extraordinary to hear the stories of the valor with which they help these people come into Bangladesh. And in addition to the border guards, who, in addition to helping on a humanitarian basis, also took a number of video images on their telephones, which turned out to be very valuable evidence. That's another discussion. The local farmers, who are very poor people, they have very, very little, would take all of the rice and food that they had, cook it in a big pot, get on their rickshaw or moped, and come to the refugee camp and help feed these famished populations. It puts to shame the attitude that we have in the Western world towards refugee. It's truly shameful to see the generosity of those people with what little they have, and to see the discourse that we have in our own societies. Now, one image that really was incredibly powerful in the midst of this sea of misery were, of course, the children. And the smiles can be very deceptive, because when you really hear what some of them have witnessed, it's astonishing that they were running around and playing. But one sight that really struck me in the midst of this massive camp was, if we go to the next image, a wooden Ferris wheel that was made from what was a wildlife refuge. So someone had chopped down the trees and thought about making a hand-operated makeshift Ferris wheel. If we go to the next image, you see that there was a very big crowd waiting to ride this Ferris wheel. And it was the one distraction that the children had to take their minds off of the horrible trauma that they had to countenance. So that's the last photo, and my intention really was to make us realize that these are real people. This is not some news item that pops up on our Facebook feed or whatever the case may be. These are real people, and they are no different than you and I. So now the question of justice. And there are many aspects to the Rohingya crisis. There's the humanitarian crisis, the need to provide immediate food and medicine and relief and housing, and there are many issues which I can't really address, I'm not qualified to address. But when you have a situation of mass atrocities, and we know that we have definition of crimes against humanity, widespread systematic attack against the civilian population. We don't need to be technical. It's a mass crime. Crimes against humanity is, simple terms, a massive crime, which is exactly what we have here. There's a reason why 1 million people have crossed the border into Bangladesh in these circumstances. It's a systematic policy which went from what was entrenched discrimination, statelessness, the characterization, false characterization of the indigenous Rohingya population as illegal Bengali immigrants. The word Rohingya is not even used in Myanmar. It is anathema. They are Bengalis, which is not true at all. So leaving that aside, this atrocity was foreseeable. And we have in Canada, I recognize our dear Rohingya friends who've come all the way from Kitchener here, and I commend them for their action and for wanting to be involved in these various efforts to address this issue. But they will know better than I that there have been waves of Rohingya refugees, and the last one was probably in 1992, 93, and some of you may have come to Canada in that wave of violence. So the systematic discrimination was always there, and at some point the Myanmar leadership came to the conclusion that it must solve this problem through a kind of final solution, the total elimination of the Rohingya population. So that's it. We have a crime against humanity. It is not a set of isolated, random crimes being committed by some bad soldiers here and there. It's a systematic policy. It's the objective of the government to eliminate an entire population solely because of their religious identity. So what do we do? Well, we have this thing called the International Criminal Court. I worked with the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia back in 1993. Then there was a second ad hoc tribunal for Rwanda. And in 1998, after 40 years after the Nuremberg judgment and the promise of international criminal justice, the world community finally adopted the Statute of the International Criminal Court at a diplomatic conference in Rome. In 2002, 4 years later, that statute entered into force when the necessary number of states ratified the instrument. So the International Criminal Court, like any other international court, only has jurisdiction in relation to states that have accepted it. That's the difference between international law and domestic law. International courts don't have automatic jurisdiction. So only states that signed this treaty accepted that the court would have jurisdiction. And you can imagine that it's the worst states that are not going to sign the statute of the court. It's not going to be, Sweden and Canada and all of those countries that are enthusiastic supporters of the court, but it's the Syrias of the world and the Irans and Iraqs and Myanmars that are not going to recognize the court's jurisdiction. So there's one loophole, if you like, which is for the Security Council of the United Nations to refer a situation to the court irrespective of the consent of a particular government. In the case of Yugoslavia, that's exactly what the UN Security Council did. The leadership of Slobodan Milosevic, that was committing ethnic cleansing against the Bosnian Muslims, was obviously not going to recognize the jurisdiction of any court, but there is this provision in Chapter 7 of the UN Charter which allows the Security Council to adopt what are binding measures irrespective of the consent of states. On two occasions, once in 2005 in relation to the ethnic cleansing in Darfur in the Sudan, and in 2011 in relation to the atrocities of the Gaddafi regime in Libya, the Security Council referred a situation to the court, giving the court jurisdiction. Except that there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council: the United Kingdom, France, United States, China, and Russia, and any one of them can veto a decision of the Council. So, in regard to Myanmar, it's easy to see why the Security Council has not taken this action. First of all, no government has really pressed for it, because no government has a pressing interest in the Rohingya issue. The second problem is that, as in the case of Syria, where Russia vetoed attempts to refer the situation, it's likely that one of the permanent members, in this case, would also exercise the veto power. It's almost certain that it would do so, and I will leave it to your imagination which member that would be, which two members, most probably. So that option does not exist, and Myanmar is not a party to the statute of the court. So what do we do? Well, some time ago, a group of people began to start thinking creatively about the jurisdiction of the court. Bangladesh is a member of the court, and whatever occurs on the territory of Bangladesh does fall within the jurisdiction of the court. And among the different types of crimes against humanity, crimes against humanity is implemented through different types of acts, such as murder, torture, rape, and the type of acts that we can all imagine would be used in situations of extreme violence. One of those acts is deportation. Now, deportation is the crime of forced displacement, either through expulsion or other coercive acts, from the territory of one state to the territory of another. It involves pushing people outside of their own country. And that crime, although it begins in the territory of state A, is completed on the territory of state B, because a necessary ingredient, a crucial element, is crossing the boundary. And this isn't a revolutionary idea. Anyone who's a domestic lawyer, a criminal lawyer, would know, for example, the crime of human trafficking. It involves trafficking people across borders. If it occurs entirely within Canada, it is a different type of crime. So it's not really a revolutionary concept, except the political consequences in this case would be quite far-reaching. So the theory was that the crime of deportation is completed on the territory of Bangladesh, and therefore the court has jurisdiction. Now, it may seem at first that it's unfortunate. Well, deportation is only one, and not necessarily the worst crimes. What about the murders and the rapes and the tortures and all of these other acts? The good thing is that deportation indirectly encompasses all of those crimes, because it includes not just outright expulsion, but all coercive acts which, let's say, terrorize a civilian population into fleeing. So you don't need to come to someone's doorstep and say, could you please leave the country? It's enough to come into a village, into a town, to make it impossible for people to stay by terrorizing them. So deportation, while it is only one of the crimes, has a factual basis which encompasses all of the crimes. On April 9th, after much deliberation, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court made a request to what's called a pre-trial chamber. This is like a court of first instance that examines issues before a case goes to the investigation or trial stage. And the request was for an opinion as to whether the crime of deportation fell within the jurisdiction of the court based on Bangladesh's being a party to the statute of the court. Now, usually the prosecutor would not ask for what is in effect an advisory opinion. Typically, the prosecutor would submit evidence in order to commence an investigation, and that would be done after a prolonged period of what is called a preliminary examination, where you gather preliminary information and then decide to launch a formal investigation. And at the end of the investigation, you issue arrest warrants, and then if the individuals are arrested, the case goes to trial. That's the procedure. But in this case, the prosecutor understandably didn't want to commit the very scarce resources of the court if there were questions as to whether the court in fact has jurisdiction. So the idea was that we will ask upfront if jurisdiction will be an issue. And just before this meeting, I was speaking to a well-placed source in The Hague that tells me we may soon have a judgment. So the prosecutor's theory was basically that here are the facts which establish deportation of up to 1 million people on the territory of Bangladesh. Here is the law. Please give us an opinion as to whether this is a correct understanding of the jurisdiction of the court. On May 7th, less than a month after the prosecutor's submission, the court invited the government of Bangladesh to submit its views. And one can imagine that Bangladesh is crucial in this regard, because legally it's the only basis for the court's jurisdiction. And of course, from an evidentiary point of view, the overwhelming evidence is situated there, insofar as access to Myanmar for investigations is pretty much impossible. So as I said, I cannot speak about what the government of Bangladesh said in its submission, because it was a confidential submission. But I can say that shortly before the June 11th deadline, which was just around the time I was in Kutupalong, that the government did make a submission, and I will leave it to your imagination what that submission says in terms of support or lack of support for the position of the prosecutor. What's interesting is that a very significant number of non-governmental organizations also made what are called amicus briefs, where they lent overwhelmingly their support to the position of the prosecutor. One of those was the so-called Canadian Partnership for International Criminal Justice, which is a very large number of my wonderful Canadian colleagues who are scholars and practitioners of international criminal law, who wrote a brilliant submission. I, of course, could not be a member of that submission because I was counsel to Bangladesh, so I can praise its quality because I had nothing to do with it. But what is significant is that just a few days ago, on August 9th, after the court invited Myanmar as a non-state party to submit its views, so Myanmar is not under an obligation, it was invited, and Myanmar refused to in any way recognize the jurisdiction of the court, which isn't surprising. But Myanmar issued a press release, a press statement on August 9th, which reads like a legal brief. So they have gone out and hired lawyers. And I can tell the difference between, a bureaucrat, politician writing something and a lawyer writing. It's a very sophisticated brief which says that this whole proceeding before the court is committed in bad faith, it's part of some conspiracy against Myanmar, and so on and so forth. You can imagine the type of things. But the legal arguments are very interesting. And the legal argument, among others, but the central one, is that there is no policy to ethnically cleanse the Rohingya because Myanmar has negotiated agreements with both the government of Bangladesh and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees on repatriation. And it was interesting that when I was in the camps in Kutupalong, the so-called Shangri-La summit was being held in Singapore among the ASEAN states. And the Myanmar spokesperson, at around the same time when they were speculating on whether Bangladesh will or will not make a submission and what it will say, was making this exact argument. There's no crimes against humanity because crimes against humanity requires state action or policy, and there's no policy here. We're engaged in a counterinsurgency, what they call clearance operations against the RSOT terrorists, and we're not harming civilians. We're just rooting out the terrorists. A very typical sort of way of sanitizing mass violence. And no one would deny that to the extent that there is armed violence between parties, that is an entirely different matter. But civilians must always be spared. And this is not even a case where a few civilians here and there have been incidentally killed or injured. This is a policy which has at its very core the elimination of an entire civilian population. So the fact that Myanmar is now engaging in this kind of offensive, I think, is a promising sign, as I will explain. What's interesting is that on August 6th, 3 days before the press statements of Myanmar, an organization by the call of the Thalininga Institute for Strategic Studies, which I think is based in Yangon, also requested leave to the court to submit an amicus brief. And you have to seek the permission of the court, and the court can deny or grant the permission. And the court denied the permission quite swiftly 4 days later. And if you see the contents of that submission, it is basically a way of portraying the entire Rohingya population as terrorists who are going around beheading people and killing all the other minorities and so on and so forth. It's a horrid piece of propaganda, and the court rightfully rejected it. But I was very pleased to see that this, what we call Gongo, a government NGO, it's clearly an NGO which is being instrumentalized by the government for its own purposes, made that submission to the court because the government of Myanmar did not want to make a formal submission to the court, because then it would be lending some legitimacy to the process. So this is all good. It shows that they are worried. They're beginning to understand that this is getting serious, that at the end of the day, even if they are not a state party, even if there's no sheriff in a cowboy film that's going to come out with his gun and, arrest the bad guy, when you have an international arrest warrant against you for crimes against humanity and genocide, you're in trouble. Because you may be in power today, you may not be in power tomorrow. And even if you will be in power for a very long time, legitimacy matters in the international community. It matters to the exercise of power and influence. When you are a pariah, it becomes very difficult to exercise influence and pursue your interests in the international community. And unlike newspaper headlines, which are remembered today, forgotten tomorrow, unlike political resolutions of the UN General Assembly, which can also easily be forgotten, once there is an arrest warrant against you, it's not going to expire like the news cycle. It will be there, and one day you will be arrested. So what I find especially encouraging, as I will explain, is that around the same time, in June of this year, I believe it was June 26th, so just a few days after the submission of Bangladesh and a few days after this sort of momentum of pressure, one of the most notorious alleged perpetrators, I'll be careful and say alleged perpetrator, Major General Mwang Soa, who is the sole Myanmar official who is on Canada's targeted sanctions list, which I hope will expand. Ali, take notice. I'm sorry? They added 6 just recently, I suppose. Very good. So, thank you. Ali, you can rest. No request. Okay, still not enough. Well, what's significant is that, well, he's also on the sanctions list of the European Union and the United States. And he was actually dismissed from the military according to certain sources. So, who is this person? This person is was the commander of the Western Regional Military Command of the so-called Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, which has played an absolutely central role in the ethnic cleansing campaign. Local militia and mobs have joined forces with the Tatmadaw, but it's driven essentially by the military forces. And that's how you can ethnically cleanse, if you like, 1 million people. It's a huge operation. Imagine the resources required to systematically attack hundreds and hundreds of villages and to expel people. So he was in charge of the Western Military Command, which includes Rakhine State, bordering Bangladesh, which is the epicenter, if you like, of the ethnic cleansing campaign. Now, under General Mwang Mwang So are a number of what we call light infantry divisions, and some of those in particular, the 33rd and the 99th, are implicated in sort of the crimes on the ground. And it's one thing to look at the boots on the ground, the executioners, and another thing to trace the criminal responsibility to those on top. And it's not a straightforward exercise. And I won't bore you with all the details. But the fact that Mwang Mwang So has been marginalized, sidelined, is another good sign, because he has become a liability, more a scapegoat, because the real person, the real protagonist here is the commander-in-chief, Min Aung Hlaing. And between him and General Mwang Mwang So is the Bureau of Special Operations. So there's basically just one level of command separating them. And these names that I mentioned now are included in paragraph 92 of the recent report of the UN Fact-Finding Commission that was issued in August 24th, just, 4 days ago, 5 days ago. And it's quite remarkable, in some respects unprecedented, that a human rights fact-finding commission, which is not a criminal investigative body, has chosen to name names, 6 names in particular. So I was simply repeating the names that many of us knew all along are definitely implicated, but their names now appear in a report of a commission which once again openly calls for genocide prosecutions before the International Criminal Court and asks the Security Council to make a referral, which I still don't think is going to happen. So fortunately, we may soon have a ruling from the court in the coming weeks, and if the court concurs with the request of the prosecutor and the overwhelming majority of legal opinion that it does have jurisdiction, then we may very well see the beginnings of an investigation in the coming months. I will end by saying that criminal investigations are very time-consuming and very resource-intensive. That's the difference between preparing a Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International report, or a UN report for that matter, which actually took a year in this particular instance, as opposed to producing proof beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal trial which implicates particular individuals, which establishes not merely that mass atrocities occurred, but traces through a chain of command the criminal responsibility of particular individuals at the very top, because this isn't a question, as I said, of a few bad soldiers. This is a question of a systematic policy which is being devised and implemented from the very top. So one of the issues that I'm concerned about, given the fact that the court has very limited resources and can be notoriously slow, and here is where I'm going to target my dear friend Ali once again, because he's our member of parliament who speaks for the downtrodden and oppressed. I think that one of the contributions that Canada can make, and Canada has been playing a very important role with the special envoy, Bob Rae, for whom I have the highest regard, and I know he's been fighting tirelessly to do what he can realistically in a sea of indifference. He's really tried to move things forward. But I would hope that Canada could perhaps contribute a team of top investigators to go into Kutupalong and start building a dossier which could be handed over to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, which would help short-circuit what would otherwise be a very long investigation, given the very scarce resources that the court has. And I will just end by saying that despite the horrors of Kutupalong, there are still about 400,000, I believe, Rohingya remaining in Myanmar. So while seeking justice for the crimes that have already been perpetrated, we need to seize the potential to deter further crimes by sending the message that any further atrocities will be very carefully scrutinized, and that the international community is determined to bring to justice those that have committed these crimes. And if the mere threat of the ICC investigation, let alone arrest warrants, could have some deterrence effect in helping the 500,000 or so Rohingya that remain within the country, I think that in itself would have been a highly worthwhile effort. So with that in mind, I'll stop here and thank once again the Noor Cultural Center and the Kanji family and all of you for showing your support and coming here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Akhavan, for sharing your insights born of a wealth and depth of experience with international criminal law. I think it's been extremely valuable for all of us here tonight. Now, we do have question and answer. Would you prefer to sit, take a break, or stand? Okay. And while you're getting water, maybe I'll start the grilling off with a question. Which is, in our public and government discourse here in Canada on addressing the Rohingya crisis, the emphasis has primarily been on depoliticized humanitarian solutions, so funding for the camps, and then questions of post hoc individual criminal responsibility. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about other international and domestic means of securing justice for the Rohingya that we as Canadians should be pressing our government to pursue in order to fulfill our obligation not only to punish genocide but also to prevent it, and also to secure a state responsibility for genocide and not just individual criminal responsibility. So basically other things we should be advocating for here on the ground.
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure I'm the best qualified person to answer it. As I explained, I think vigorous support for the ICC, should the court rule in favor of its jurisdiction, can have, and I think already has had, some measure of deterrence effect. So the effect of the court is not just what the court does, but the importance that the international community attaches to what the court does. So the court can issue the arrest warrant, but if everyone ignores it, and we know this from the experience of Darfur and President Bashir, so the international community has to make it clear that anyone that is going to be an indicted person will be an international pariah, that they will not be welcome, they cannot travel, they cannot participate in international conferences and UN and so on and so forth. So that's one aspect of it. And you know, there are all sorts of political issues as well, of speaking to governments that have influence with Myanmar and trying to persuade them to pressure the government to stop the atrocities. One other possibility which exists is a case before the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention, but that would require a state that would be willing to invest its resources and prestige in bringing such a proceeding where it doesn't have a direct interest, if you like. And that will typically require some very sort of visionary political leadership, which is sorely lacking, unfortunately.
So there's a microphone. No. Oh, there's a microphone here, so everyone please make your way to the mic if you have questions. I can ask more questions. Okay, while people... Oh, everyone who has a question, please come to the microphone, so because we're taping too. Yeah.
But she can't walk.
But we'll start with the question here.
Hi, thank you very much for the enlightening educational talk on the issue of justice. I'm just wondering about the repatriation agreements that have been signed between the government of Myanmar and the government of Bangladesh, and also the agreements between UNHCR and UNDP and the government of Myanmar, I believe, to prepare the way for repatriation. I mean, I think we know not a lot is happening on those, but will those be a hindrance in any way? I mean, will those support Myanmar's case a bit stronger so that they won't be accountable? I mean, how do you see those agreements affecting the justice situation?
It's a very good question, and again, I have to be cautious about, how far I discuss these issues. Some would say that it's important to not confront Myanmar because then they may pull out of these agreements. Others will say, well, the agreements are useless because they have absolutely no intention of repatriating anyone, and nobody that has been expelled wants to return to Myanmar unless there is guarantees of protection. And who's going to provide guarantees of protection? The only possibility would be a massive UN peacekeeping force, and that option is dead on arrival because Myanmar would absolutely refuse it, and no state with sufficient influence would be willing to infringe Myanmar's sovereignty in the parlance of restrictive diplomacy. So I think that there's very little to lose. That's just my own impression, but again, it's not my area of expertise.
I have a fantasy question for Professor Akhavan. You started off with a very interesting set of words, which are never again. Now, I'm the child of 2 Holocaust survivors, and it's been ever again and ever again. What is it going to take for this to stop, and for the people of the world to take notice, and to stop genocide before it gets to this point?
Easy question. I wish I had an answer. And I always like to say I look forward to the day when people like me will be unemployed, completely unemployed, because that would be a great world. Unfortunately, that's not the world that we live in. Having said that, I think that if we look at the brutality of history, what was it Gibbon said, history is about the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind. That we live still in an age which holds tremendous hope. The fact that we don't casually accept extermination and enslavement of vanquished people, which is what we did throughout history. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is 70 years old against, 4,000 years of recorded history. So that's not much of a comfort to the children in the refugee camps, my professorial explanation. But that's what we have to do. We just have to build the building blocks of a new civilization which respects human rights, which strengthens institutions that are created in order to redress these injustices. And it's a long, painful, bloody, and messy process, but we can't give up. But I would still say that in another world, no one would even bother about giving humanitarian relief to the Rohingya. In another world, the UN wouldn't even bother to talk about what is happening and would simply say that what Myanmar does on its own territory is its own business. So we've come very far, and believe it or not, things could have been even worse. At least the Myanmar military has to take care to cover its tracks, to attack the villages one by one, to, there are all sorts of subtle aspects to how the crimes are committed in an age in which international law and human rights matters at some level. So as I said once again, it's not much of an answer to those people who have suffered in this way, but we have to exploit what few tools we have and do the best that we can. And I think it is significant that Myanmar cannot just ignore what is happening. So we just have to pile on the pressure and make sure that these crimes aren't swept under the carpet and forgotten, because that is the message we also need to send to the next government that thinks about committing similar crimes.
Thank you for the talk. Two questions that go in line with what you've just said. One is, it seems to me that the work you do requires a very high level of patience. The time it takes to see action taken, the time it takes to get together evidence, things like that. And certainly I could see as, potentially a final outcome being the prosecution of individuals. Are there smaller milestones along the way that you can sort of see as stepping stones or some sort of small successes on the path to some of those bigger ones, like seeing people come to justice? And then the other question would be, is there, in your experience, any sort of indication that when a world leader or a military sees these other people being held accountable for their actions, then that they rethink or scale back what they have been something terrible that they've been contemplating doing or have already started but then stopped? Like, I lived in a country for about 10 years that dismissed the UN completely. It's like it doesn't exist sort of thing, and I felt like they lived in such a bubble that I'm not sure how much the actions that were taken against other people in other countries had any sort of influence on what they did. But again, I'm no expert. No, I did live there, but I was talking about Venezuela.
Once again, it's a great question, but the answer is very difficult, because how do you measure these things? And it depends on the nature of the government. So my first experience was with the former Yugoslavia, which was a European state and was susceptible to pressure by the European Union, the World Bank, and so on and so forth. And we ended up with former President Slobodan Milosevic in the dock. It was unthinkable when I saw him coming to The Hague. I thought it was a dream. It was unthinkable, but it happened. And after 16 years, we got Ratko Mladic, nasty general who was responsible for Srebrenica, and Radovan Karadzic. So every situation has its own peculiarities. And then you have Sudan, where there's been an arrest warrant against President Bashir for how many years, and Sudan maybe isn't particularly susceptible to international pressure, and no one has really pressured them, including the Western countries who have other geopolitical interests in Sudan. And the court was saddled with the case, but then given no real support to give effect to the arrest warrants. And at the end of the day, as I said, there's no army in the basement of the International Criminal Court that's going to go and invade countries and arrest people. You can only achieve that through sustained pressure, through hurting regimes where it counts and forcing them to cooperate. So every situation has its own peculiarities, but I do think that Myanmar is vulnerable. Maybe not as much as the former Yugoslavia, but there are weak spots, and I think over time, this kind of isolation and pariah status will exact a cost. And the members of the military, they make a lot of money. The military business complex. They like to go shopping in London and Paris and Singapore and whatever the case may be. So the question is, once we get those arrest warrants, if we do, what use can we make of them to make sure that they matter and they curtail the exercise of power by the Myanmar military? And as I said, the demotion of this major general is a positive sign.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I wanted to thank you for your talk, and I'm glad that you're able to be patient and to be hopefully patient. So my question isn't exactly about the justice, but you mentioned that there were 700,000 Rohingya in the camp that you visited, and now there's 500,000, 500,000. Where did the other 200,000 go?
My statistics may be not entirely accurate, but I was told that there are about 700,000. But we have an expert in the audience, yes?
I just came back from 7 months working over there.
Yes.
I have another question.
Rhonda was with the UNHCR in Kutupalong. She will know better than I.
Just briefly, they just moved them into other camps in the region. So Kutupalong became a little less congested, but there's other camps further in the Cox's Bazar district. So they just reconfigured, but they're all still there.
Okay.
Okay.
So
Thank you, Rhonda.
Yeah. The other thing I want to say is just a comment about the fact of this agreement to repatriate them, which seems to me kind of ridiculous given the situation. Their villages have been razed, their houses have been, even the topography of the area is changed so that people who've actually gone back cannot even tell where they were living. So where did we get the idea that they could ever go back under any circumstances?
Well, once again, there are people better qualified, such as Rhonda, who was with the UNHCR there. I think, in principle,
yes,
in every situation, an effort has to be made to repatriate people voluntarily in conditions of safety and dignity. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but the effort has to be made. And the reality is, and once again, I'm speaking in my completely personal capacity, that Bangladesh, which is the densest country in the world, the most densely populated country in the world, with a huge problem of land shortage, now has 1 million hungry mouths to feed.
Yes.
And we know what happens when you have a long-term refugee population with the resentment and the trauma, and it usually doesn't end well. So there has to be some long-term solution for
yes,
these, up to 1 million people. So I don't think anyone is going to force these people to go back. I think that's very clear. No one's going to force them. But to the extent that Myanmar can be pressured to admit some of them to return, to the extent that there could be some procedure in place to ensure their safety, it has to be tried. But I agree with you that it's not likely to succeed. It's not likely to succeed.
Well, it scares me that they would go back, so I don't know how they would feel. But thank you for your answer.
Small numbers have gone back, but there are also reports that they end up in what are effectively internment camps, and it's a choice. The point is, it must be voluntary. And when I was there, and Rhonda, you will know this. There's what was it called? The zero ground. There is a place between the fence, which marks the Myanmar border, and the actual border of Bangladesh, which is a no man's land, but it's actually in Myanmar. And many of the refugees are crowded there, and they refuse to cross what is a small creek over to the Bangladesh side, because once they cross, they become refugees. They're now IDPs, and they still want to say, we're in Myanmar, we haven't left our country. So you talk to some people and they say, we want to go back. We have no life here in a refugee camp. And you talk to others and say, we would rather be killed than to go back. Everyone has their own complicated story. So it's difficult to generalize. And even if a small number can go back, I think it's worth trying.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Prime Minister, follow-up question to that. We know that this problematic repatriation possibilities aren't just about Myanmar. There are also other regimes that are helping them. For example, Prime Minister Modi of India pledged to provide building materials for the concentration camp-like structures that the Rohingya would be housed in. So are there any mechanisms of pressure that can be brought to bear on them? And to what extent do we also need to focus on these other enabling regimes?
Yeah, these are very complex questions. And as I said, I don't feel qualified to answer them. I'm not an expert on refugee issues. So whatever I say is at a relatively superficial level. But I think the key is that all repatriation must be voluntary. That's the point. The question is everyone sufficiently informed when they decide to return as to where they will end up? And I'm not in a position to know what information they're provided about what they're actually walking into. But all of this is really within the province of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Organization for Migration, actually, which apparently plays an even bigger role than the UNHCR in Bangladesh, and the wider, discourse of the international community. And it's such a horrible situation that sometimes you just have to choose the lesser of two evils. There is no good solution to 1 million traumatized people that have lost their homes.
Thank you so much for not only your talk, but for all of you, the work that you do. I was lucky enough to be given a copy of the author who wrote this incredible book and did the CBC series and so on and so forth. And I would urge everybody to buy the book, share it with others, make sure it's in the libraries, and read it, because the volumes of information in there are just amazing.
And we did not pay Dorothy to say that. That was completely spontaneous.
It certainly is. I have a couple of questions. One is, what kind of leadership, as a person who's very involved in peace and social justice and environmental ecosystem health, what kind of social analysis and movements are coming, or leadership are coming from the people who are in those camps? Because there must be many people who do have those leadership skills. And is there some sort of a direction that they're taking in addition to all the larger political work that's being done?
It's a very good question. And once again, I think we have much better qualified people in the room who've just spent 7 months in the camps working with the refugees. And my interaction with the refugees was quite limited. It was, narrowly focused on a question of, criminal liability and evidence gathering. But I was quite moved to see, I gave you the Ferris wheel as one small example of the incredible resilience of people and I've seen it again and again in Rwanda and halfway across the world, that people, we should not underestimate also the power of the human spirit to face the unthinkable and go on living. And there were a number of tents which were especially for women and girls, for example, to give them a kind of space in which they could receive therapy, companionship, and that was something I hadn't seen in refugee camps, 10, 20 years ago. So we're evolving, we're understanding better the importance of healing. It's not just giving people food and medicine, but also helping heal their souls. And I was very impressed by the members of the refugee community that were beginning to organize themselves. The women that I met and another group who were men, the photos of which I didn't show, were quite well organized. They're beginning to organize themselves. They're starting to collect the stories of the survivors. One of the recommendations, and thank you for your question because it reminded me, another recommendation that I do have is the establishment of a truth commission, which is a very cost-effective, high-impact initiative. And I said this to our High Commission in Dhaka, and I really hope that is taken seriously. Because as important as the ICC is, I think a truth commission is even more important to the healing process, because I've seen again the cathartic effect of simply unburdening yourself of your trauma. And a good therapist, I'm not a therapist, but I've learned how important it is for people to reconstitute their shattered self-image, to restore their dignity. So what would it take to have, a panel of 3 or 5 distinguished commissioners who will sit in Kutupalong camp and hear the stories of these people, to have those stories recorded, broadcast through the media across the world, including in Myanmar, in the local languages, so the Myanmar public also sees what the consequence has been of this hate propaganda. So that's another initiative that I think could be done with very limited resources, and it would make a world of difference to the healing process of the people.
Who could organize such a program?
Well, it would probably best be implemented by an NGO in Bangladesh, working in collaboration with the refugee organizations that are emerging, because there's a kind of like a leadership emerging in, you can imagine, among 500, 700,000 people. So I'm not, once again, an expert on the NGO community in Bangladesh, but there are reputable NGOs. And once again, Canada could play a very important role in doing that. And typically, truth commissions are dismissed as being, unimportant. But even though I'm a lawyer and I believe in, courts and trials, I think truth commissions can be very, very valuable. And they can give immediate benefit to the survivors. A truth commission isn't dependent on arresting someone, putting them on trial. It's victim-centered. And a trial, as important as it is, how many people are going to try? 5? At best, 5, 10 among thousands of perpetrators. And how many witnesses who have been victims will be able to testify? At most 100. So how do you give a large population an opportunity to tell their stories? A truth commission. So and we know that from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here, from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa. So thank you for your question, because it reminded me of this.
Good. Well, maybe we could help promote that by talking to our members of parliament. And, is Bob Ray thinking about those kinds of things as well, that we could maybe support?
I think I may have mentioned this to Mr. Ray. So, but in any event, it's something that we can raise, and I've mentioned it to our High Commission in Dhaka, and we have some wonderful people there. We really have great Canadian diplomats who are really trying to do what they can.
Great. So, the other question I have, another question and a comment. What about Aung San Suu Kyi? What about her?
The elephant in the room. We
supported her over the years. She was such a heroine, and now should Canada be taking away the honorary citizenship that they gave her?
Well, many people have said that, and the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg has now obscured her image, and they're going to apparently replace the image with image of Rohingya refugees, and I think that's certainly called for. The question of withdrawing an honorary citizenship, why not? I mean, from a point of view of moral responsibility, I think she has failed to do what we should legitimately expect from a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. At the very least, even if it's politically inconvenient, or especially because it's politically inconvenient, I think that she should have stood in solidarity with the victims and paid the price. And that is why we give people Nobel Prizes. So I think it's been a grave disappointment. The question of criminal responsibility is a very different and more complex issue, but that also has to be on the table. So yes, I think that there is now widespread view that she should be dethroned from her sort of moral plateau.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just end by saying that a colleague who couldn't come tonight suggested that you should be the next head of the United Nations.
Thank you, but I'm fine outside of the United Nations. But thank you for the thoughts. When I joined the UN as a student intern many years ago, I was in law school, so I went, what's the expression, bushy-tailed and bright-eyed, or whatever the expression. I was there really excited, and one of these bureaucrats that had been there for too long, he looked at me and says, son, you need 3 things to survive in the UN. I said, what is that? He said, geritol, alcohol, and protocol. And so I shall say no more.
Assalamu alaikum and hello. First of all, I would like to thank the Noor Center for organizing this, and of course thank Professor Akhavan for this very insightful talk. I have learned a lot of things, and I'm really sort of excited, and probably I'm going to forget my question as well. I am myself a Rohingya. My name is Anwar Arkani. I live in Kitchener. We drove all the way, my colleague and I. I am a two-time refugee myself. First time we fled in 1978. That's when Burmese government actually tried 3 big times to completely get rid of us. First time it was in 78, second time 91, 92, and this is the third time in a sense. This is a longer time because it was from 2012 until now. So if I put in a shorter version, the repatriation is not going to do anything, or not going to happen, or not going to resolve the problem, because we were repatriated in the 70s or late 70s and 90s. People went back to Burma to suffer more or to suffer multiple times. That was the reality of our lives. That's why we're still in the circle of getting killed and suffering and being raped and all those things. We're never out of the circle. So now, listening to your talk, the report from the UN and then International Criminal Court and all sort of other international big players, it is going to take very long time, really, to solve the issue. In the meantime, what are the solutions I still have? I actually lost my family members, siblings, and close relatives, more than 70 people. And I stopped counting since 2016. I don't know how many more I've lost already. Now I have 3 surviving siblings. One is younger than me, my younger sister, 2 elder sisters, and they have children and grandchildren. What is going to happen to them? Not only them. It's actually, UN is saying there's 1 million, and I can guarantee you it's a lot more than 1 million. Because I myself and my colleague here, we have unregistered people sneak into Bangladesh community because in the past they were forcefully repatriated, and they don't want to register. They don't trust anyone, no UN, no Bangladesh. They don't trust anyone, so they do not register in the camp, and they are in the gram, in the rural area. We send ration and food and stuff like that. Now, what is going to happen? Is there a solution? I mean, what is the short-term solution until something happens for these people is the question one. The other question is, if I'm not a scholar, I'm not a very highly educated person as well, but if I look back, if I read the past genocide, all those genocide stop only when some other countries bomb and destroy the country. Soft war, diplomacy, written thing, they don't stop, really. And so is there something going to happen like that, or is there some big countries, or a couple of big countries, and go and say, okay, there's a new line here. Burmese government said, these people are not from our country, they're from Bangladesh. Maybe the line was drawn when the British gave us the independence. Line was drawn from at a wrong place. Maybe we need to redraw the line. Is there something going to happen like this? Those are 2 questions.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and I'm glad to see you again. And I remember we met the first time at McGill University when you'd driven 8 hours to Montreal in the discussion I had with Bob Ray. And my heartfelt condolences for the plight of your family and your people. Your question is an excellent question, but once again, it's not one for which I have a good answer. And I think that once again, my own sort of narrow area of expertise here is the question of accountability, and there are so many other issues which I'm really not qualified to speak about. But from my perspective, which is not necessarily the most informed, I think the refugees in Bangladesh are overwhelmingly going to stay. I don't see any significant return. I don't think that any country is going to seriously confront Myanmar. So the point is that one has to do what one can in imperfect circumstances, and that's an understatement. In deeply distressing circumstances, we have to fight and struggle as best as we can. We have to give at least relief to the people who are hungry, who need shelter, who need medicine. There's some thought now about constructing a settlement, on an island where some of those could be resettled. But eventually, I think that there needs to be some kind of burden sharing with the refugees, not all of whom can be in Bangladesh, because it's a burden that realistically it cannot bear. And as I said, the focus has to be on trying to save the roughly 500,000 Rohingya that remain in the country. And because there's going to be no intervention anytime soon, one way of doing that is by magnifying constantly the evidence of the atrocities, putting the leadership on notice that they will pay a price, expanding targeted sanctions. And I think countries like China, countries like Singapore, which is the banking center for the money, the massive amounts of money that the leadership has gathered, that we need to think more creatively about how to exact a cost. I've learned that money matters, and very often political power is exactly about accumulation of wealth, obscene amounts of wealth, and the Myanmar military for a very long time has been involved in all sorts of illicit businesses. And so Singapore is one possible weak point, but it will take someone to pressure Singapore into doing something. So we know that the United States from time to time adopts sanctions. Could one impose sanctions on banks in Singapore that do business with the Myanmar leadership, and say that if you do business with Myanmar, then you cannot bank in the United States? I mean, that could be very effective. But someone has to do that. Someone has to have the ear of Congress. I give up on the president, so that this becomes a political issue, because that's how things are done. So there are a number of things that could be achieved to just increase the pressure. Measures which are realistic, not fantasies that we have, which sadly are not going to happen. And I think the idea of redrawing boundaries is, with the greatest respect, it's a bad idea, as much as boundaries throughout the world are arbitrary. And I've seen it in former Yugoslavia. It was the same thing. The war was about boundaries, and redrawing of boundaries usually doesn't end well. So I think the real issue is how to treat people with respect and to secure their human rights wherever they're residing. That's the real issue. So once again, I'm very sorry I don't have a good answer. All I can say is that these are historical struggles, and when things are happening, one is just focused on surviving. But I can say from the experience of other communities that there is a tomorrow, even in the wake of genocide. And sometimes, sadly, these traumatic events can create a much stronger and cohesive identity for a people, and that kind of suffering can also be transformed through resilience in a very constructive way. I've seen victim communities throughout the world that have transformed their misfortune in dramatic ways. So I'm sorry for not giving you an answer.
Thank you.
I think we are running short on time because we said we would end by 8:30. So if anyone else who's sitting in the audience currently has a question, if you could please just line up on the mic so we can see how many people we have, and we might take maybe 2 or 3 questions together. Oh, there's lots of questions. Okay, is it okay if we take 3 questions?
Yeah, maybe just ask them.
Or ask them all?
Yeah, and then I'll
okay,
answer it. No, I'll remember it. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, we'll just go down the line and take all the questions, and then Professor Akhavan will answer all of them, inshallah.
Okay, thank you. What I wondered was, you mentioned the building blocks of civilization, that somehow these are pieces that help build in, I guess, cultures and nations and things like that, that almost avert things like this. So I'm wondering, myself, maybe us, like what are those building blocks of civilization that I can build in myself so that I'm a resource when there is something that happens somewhere? And every person, I think, in a nation is part of what happens. So if you could just say something, thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm very proud and glad to be here tonight and listen to Professor Payam. It's a great opportunity. My name is Ainun Afroza. I'm a professor of pediatrics in Bangladesh Medical University, but I moved to Canada in 2012, and now I'm a Canadian. But inside me, I have a Bangladeshi heart. So I have been following the stories and histories of Rohingya issues throughout the year. And then last May, I decided that I will go and see what is happening there. I really wanted to observe and feel in my heart that how people are living there and what is happening. So I went to Bangladesh in May, mid of May, just before you went there, and I made it possible to enter into the camp because you know that it's very difficult. It is being managed in a very nice manner so that no outsiders can come and they can distribute money or they can do anything in that camp areas. So the credit goes to the government of Bangladesh as well as the NGOs who are working with the government, supporting the government. So I have many experiences. I have more than 100, 200 pictures in my phone, and I have at least 20 video clips with me, which I am preparing to make a presentation in future. But my feeling is that we are thinking of Rohingyas, that's okay. They have children, they have girls, they have women, they have adolescents. And those adolescents are really a great threat because they cannot sit idle in a camp. Because in the camp, they have so many restrictions of life. And those women who were pregnant, they are giving birth to babies. And now, Bangladesh cannot register them as their citizen. And they cannot throw them out. Okay, sure. My question is, in the present situation, Bangladesh also has many problems of their own, as you said. So how do you suggest that the government of Bangladesh can handle, I'm thinking from their perspective, because Rohingya people look like us, they talk like us, they dress like us, they easily mix with our population, and there are a lot of drug trafficking things and other crimes as well. So if you can give a good guideline on that, I will be appreciated. Thank you very much.
Yes, I want to turn everybody's look at the country we are in, and the way the people were treated in this country. I want to ask a question today and make a point that nobody is held responsible for the ancestors of today's black population in Canada, black Canadians, whose ancestors were brought in ships from Africa on this land. And as you know, what being a slave means. You can buy people for money, you can sell them. The owner can kill a person with no consequences. I think it's the worst that could happen to a human being is being a slave. So there was no apology from Canadian federal government at all. These people are not getting any privileges, as I would compare, for example, with First Nations people, who do get certain privileges, for example, not paying taxes, though they were not slaves in this country. So who's held responsible? Well, the answer is nobody. For the babies that were ripped from their mothers' hands by RCMP in this very country, all the children taken from their homes and put in residential schools, who is held responsible? Who is going to court to answer for this? Answer is nobody in this very country. Who else? Japanese people's treatment during Second World War. They had to leave their homes. They could not live in their homes anymore. They were put in internment camps in Canada, in other provinces. And do you think they were allowed to go to their homes when the war was finished? That was not the case. And the treatment of Chinese people who built the railway all across Canada, and the head tax was imposed not only on that particular group. So I would make a point that this country was built on racism and discrimination. And I have evidence to suggest that. To prove it, actually.
Thank you.
Okay. I think I concur with the brother from the Rohingya brother that there should be basis for military intervention. I don't think that countries have to, the UN has to get the permission of a country to intervene. I think in most cases, the UN pressures countries, and then those countries allow for deployment of peacekeeping forces. Myanmar is a very small country, impoverished country. We have seen how the UN has pushed its weight in terms of intervening in the Congo very quickly, in Somalia, in Central Africa, in other places. In Iraq in 1991, the UN actually authorized use of force. And I don't think why it should not authorize use of force in Myanmar. The problem is I think we have to expose double standards when it comes to interventions. Most UN interventions or other interventions by organizations like NATO are driven by strategic interest. The oil factor and vital resources being the reason. The Rakhine state in Myanmar doesn't sit on any non-oil reserves or anything like that, but I think we need to get beyond that and find ways to force, whenever necessary, the international community to intervene in a situation like in Myanmar, and to make sure that interventions are not solely driven by strategic interests.
My question is, there are more than 100,000 refugees are in India also. While Bangladesh is sympathetic with them, India is not. India is with Myanmar and blaming the refugees as terrorists, and they also blame that they killed many Hindus there, and they are against Hindus.
Thank you. Well, these are a lot of questions, a lot of good questions, and I'm neither qualified necessarily to answer all of them, nor do we have time to properly discuss them, but I'll maybe begin in reverse order. Refugees in India, I don't know. I don't have sufficient knowledge of what is happening, but I do know that there are some very disturbing political currents in India of ethno-nationalism, which we've seen gripping the world in other parts as well. And we know that that doesn't end well. So, but this is the first time I hear actually about the Rohingya in India, but I know that they're spread throughout the region, also in Malaysia and a number of other countries. The question of military intervention is a very complex one, and of course Canada for some time championed the idea of responsibility to protect. One question is there any political will? So yes, we could say that in an ideal world, the Security Council would transcend the narrow interests of its individual members and take collective action to prevent genocide. Sadly, we don't live in that world. And we live in a world where geopolitics and narrow interests dictate what states are willing to do. And we also are living in a world which is weary of military intervention, understandably. And I'm one that would have said that in Rwanda, for example, the world should have intervened and the world could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. But I don't think any country with the means to intervene is interested in intervening, which is why we are left with the reality that we're confronting, doing the best that we can with that reality. So I think that's really the difference between the abstract question of the ideal, what ideal should we strive towards, and what the reality is on the ground. The question of Canadians of African origin versus First Nations and history of injustice in Canada, well, you know, I don't know any country in the world which doesn't have skeletons in its closet. But I would say that I've visited about 100 countries, that this country is exceptional in willingness to confront its past, which is a lot more that I can say about the vast majority of countries that I've gone to, where there's simply no recognition. If anything, there's a retrenchment of hatred, and I could give you many, many examples. So I think that we need to recognize injustices, but the point is not to enshrine grievances, but it's to heal the wounds of the past and move forward. That's the point, to move forward and create a society which is just and which gives people equal opportunity. And I came to this country in the 1970s. I was one of 2 brown children in my schoolyard. One of 2 brown children. And when I see what the schools are like today, I say, wow, you know, it's a completely different world. So things are changing, and we're unusually blessed here. As much as we have our injustices to deal with, we should also be very grateful for the blessings. And that's exactly why I think we need to exercise leadership on the issue of the Rohingya, because that human rights consciousness also affects the society that we build at home. What the government of Bangladesh can do, I don't know. As I said, we have people here who are experts at dealing with development issues, with refugee issues, and I've been to enough war zones and refugee camps to know that this is not a simple matter. But one of the things that was impressed upon me, and that goes back to the question that you had, was the need to educate the young people. Beyond humanitarian relief, there has to be a consciousness now and awareness that these people are not going to go back. So I think they need to be empowered through education. And getting back to the example, we have the lady who was the Holocaust survivor, we have the example of the Jews, the Armenians, the Tutsi of Rwanda, and so on and so forth. That it's possible for victimized populations through education and empowerment to transform themselves, even if they end up being a displaced diaspora. So that's why I'm saying there is hope. There is hope, and efforts should be made now to give opportunities to that population, especially the young people, to educate themselves and to create a better future. And I think that from those camps, we could have great teachers and doctors and artists and who knows what. And that's maybe the power of the human spirit that I'm talking about, the ability to transform darkness into light and to show the power and the will of people to survive. And this brings me to the final question about the building blocks of civilization. Well, it's about grassroots engagement, and it's what I try to do in my CBC Massey lectures, to talk about the power of the everyday, and how, as is famously said, evil triumphs because good people do nothing. Evil triumphs because people are indifferent. So whether it is our own backyard, the history of injustices in our own backyard, or halfway across the world, we have no excuse not to be engaged. We have no excuse to do what we can. And I'll end by simply telling one of the stories that I had from my final lecture, which is that of Donovan Fontaine, who was the chief of the Saking Nation in Winnipeg. And on the day that Prime Minister Harper issued an apology for the residential schools, he had a knock on his door. And he opened the door, and an elderly immigrant couple, who were his next-door neighbors, were standing there with a plate of muffins. And they said that we had no idea what your people have gone through. And that simple gesture of empathy and caring so deeply touched Chief Donovan that he constantly tells this story. So we should never underestimate the power of our own empathy. And I think that's the real issue, whether it's the Rohingya halfway across the world or right here in our own backyard. We all need to become engaged. So I'll stop there.
All that remains is for me to say thank you again to Professor Akhavan. I think we all pray, inshallah, for the day when you will be unemployed. But in the meantime, thank you so much for the work that you do and for sharing the fruits of your experience and wisdom with us. There are books available for sale at the table here, and Professor Akhavan will be signing them. Dorothy and everyone else who has read this book says it's a must-read. So please do get your books and a chance to chat with Professor Akhavan. But so we'll conclude the formal portion of the evening now. Thank you, Professor Akhavan.
Thank you.
That was truly lovely.